Good afternoon. We'll call this meeting of the Natural Gas Development Committee to order. Ask the clerk, do we have a quorum? We do not have a quorum, so we'll go ahead and hopefully we have one in a little while. We'll go ahead and we'll move to the first presentation on the agenda is a presentation regarding an updated natural gas markets and the effects on the severance taxation for the state of West Virginia. Our presenter is John Deskins, PhD, a director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research for West Virginia University. Dr. Deskins, you have the.
All right. Oh, you got it. Oh, we got people online. Okay. We're really happy to be here in Morgan County and visit with you folks over here. Of course, I'm used to visiting with you in Charleston, but I think it's really cool how we do these interim meetings across the state. And I'm happy to talk about natural gas prices and how movements in natural gas prices affect our economy and tax revenues in our state. I just will say the presentation that I have today is a little bit short notice. So what I have now is some broad kind of preliminary information, you might say. I'll be very clear about the ways in which my presentation isn't complete today. But if you'd like a more detailed kind of report or memorandum on natural gas price fluctuations and tax revenue or other variables, happy to provide more detail over the next couple of weeks, as requested. Just, I mean, we all know that natural gas prices have been moving around quite a bit lately, but just to kind of show some numbers to support the movements that we've seen, here I've reported for you the Henry Hub price for the country. There's a few different ways to measure natural gas prices in our country. I don't know all the different ways, but the Henry Hub price is a real standard benchmark nationally to capture natural gas prices. And any deviation that we have here in West Virginia is going to move with this, even though if the exact price that we're looking at isn't exactly equivalent to that. But here you see what's happened to Henry Hub prices. If you go back to, say, just before COVID, gas prices per MCF were something like $2 or $3. If you go back to the beginning of this year, prices had risen from, let's say, 2.5 up to 5. So a doubling over the course of the 2-year period. And now over the course of just this year, prices have gone from 5 up to 8. So altogether, over a 3-year period, we're talking about prices for natural gas per MCF going from $2 or $3 up to almost $8. Big increases. Obviously, the data show that, and anybody who kind of knows about the industry recognizes that as well. I will say that the forecast here, the portion on the right in the gray, that's not our forecast. I mean, in my office, we just forecast West Virginia data. We don't forecast any national statistics. So the forecast comes from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and they do forecast, as you see, that prices will fall by the end of next year back down to about $5 or $6 per MCF. But even that will still be a real significant increase over what we had become accustomed to, before a year or before 2 years ago. So big increases. Some of that's going to kind of calm down a little bit, but even a year from now, prices will still be high. And of course, a lot of this depends on the war in Ukraine. Obviously, the spike this year has been driven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the removal of Russian gas from the global market, thus the big spike. Just another really interesting figure to show, kind of also in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the disappearance of that Russian gas off the global market. Here you see, this isn't West Virginia specific data, but here's US LNG exports, liquefied natural gas exports from the US. Of course, as you see there, and as we all know, we didn't really have the infrastructure to export LNG before about 2017, but there you see how much exports have increased over the course of the past 5 years or so, and absolutely overwhelming increase in LNG exports over the past several years. Even just for this year, exports have gone from about $30 billion to over $50 billion just this year. Part of that is because of increases in the quantity of LNG that we're exporting. But of course, another part of that is just the price increase that we just talked about. I mean, this figure is not isolating quantity versus price. It's just total exports, and you see what's happening. It's hard to make a whole lot of sense out of this figure, though, because the figure is driven by the demand side, by increases in demand for our LNG exports, but the figure is also driven by just infrastructure and capacity. As I was just talking about a second ago with my friend back there, we're just now building out the infrastructure to make this happen. So there's been a lot of latent demand there, demand that existed in the world, but we just didn't have the infrastructure to meet that demand. So this is partially driven by increases in demand, but it's also driven by just increases in our ability to export because of our infrastructure investments. Anyway, turning to West Virginia specifically now, I'll talk about how this price volatility affects economic outcomes in the state broadly, and then I'll talk about what we're most interested in, how this price volatility affects tax revenue and our budget surplus here in West Virginia. But I'll start off by talking about how this price volatility affects production and employment. I think this first figure is pretty important. This is total natural gas production from West Virginia. You can draw your own conclusions. I don't have any special insight into this really, but I'll just be honest. My personal opinion is that this is all supply side driven, right? We've had incredible increases in our ability to produce natural gas from our state over the last decade due to, these dramatic increases in technology. And once the technology advanced, then we had to wait for infrastructure to catch up. I mean, the demand for our gas from West Virginia has been there for a long time, but this is all technology driven and infrastructure driven, all this increase. This is an increase of a factor of 10 times. If you look, we start out at 25. The unit of measurement there is billions of cubic feet per month. We start out at 25. Now we're at 250, a factor of 10 for the increase over the last decade, but it's all supply side driven, technology and infrastructure. Because it's supply side driven, movements in demand, like the volatility that we've seen in global demand this year, like the volatility that we've seen in that price this year, it's just not manifesting itself in our production. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I mean, this is all just catching up with where demand has been for a long time. But the price volatility that you see hasn't made much of a difference this year, because we're not even to the point with infrastructure that we're going to see short-term movements in response to short-term price fluctuations. So far, we haven't seen much there. Over time, as our infrastructure develops more, as the industry becomes more fully developed after these technological changes, we might see a closer, tighter short-term relationship between price and production. But right now, I don't see it. Instead of looking at overall production, it might make more sense to look at new wells that are being drilled. You might see more of a short-term response between price and economic activity by looking at the drilling side, not by looking at the total output side. Because that total output figure, of course, is also blurred by the fact that we have all these existing wells that are producing gas, and we're not going to just cut off those wells that are being drilled, and the yellow line shows the amount of gas that's coming from each new well. I will say, just the caveat is, this is for the Appalachian Basin. This is for West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. We don't have data for West Virginia specifically for this, so this is for all three states. But I'm confident that the point remains, whether we look at West Virginia or the entire three-state region. But as you see, ignoring 2022, the number of new wells that have been drilled has actually been way down over the past couple of years. But that's mostly a supply side issue as well, because each new well is so much more productive than it was just a few years ago. I mean, you see even over the last 2 years, you see how much productivity has increased for each new well because that technology has been advancing so rapidly. So far fewer wells, but output is still increasing rapidly because each individual well is so much more productive. But here, I don't have a pointer, but I mean, it's clear. I won't deviate. I don't want you to yell at me for getting away from the mic here for the people online. But you see what you might call a small responsiveness that we have seen this year. The jump that we've seen in 2022. We've gone from, it's not a very big increase. It's an increase from about 30, the rig count being 30 in the Appalachian Basin, up to a rig count of about 50 in the Appalachian Basin. That's relatively small compared to the big movements that we've seen over the last decade, but that's what we've seen. So if we do see a responsiveness right now to the price volatility that we've seen globally this year, then that's really where it is. It's not in total output because of the issues that I just described. It's in the new wells that are being drilled, and that's the degree of the responsiveness that we could possibly attribute to the short-term price jump this year. Does that make sense? Now that's the production side. Now we're looking at the employment side. The yellow portion of the figure represents the total number of jobs in natural gas production in West Virginia. As you see, if you just look on the axis over there, we're talking about 6,000 jobs altogether in West Virginia nowadays associated with natural gas. Just because it's interesting, I added on natural gas pipeline construction jobs, and the blue portion that's really volatile is natural gas pipeline construction jobs, obviously related, but that's not the production side specifically. That's the infrastructure, the construction side. Anyway, kind of the same issue. We don't really see any response, or at least we don't see hardly any response in employment to the price volatility that we've seen this year. You can see how much of a movement that we've observed. It's been, it's kind of hard to tell on this scale. It may be a couple hundred jobs that we've seen for the increase this year. So because of the infrastructure issues, because of the technology that's driving production, because this is mostly a supply side issue, price volatility has had almost no effect on employment this year. It's had some effect on rig count, almost no effect on employment. I hope that makes sense. So that's the big picture, the effect of volatility on real economic outcomes in the state. Now I'll turn over to what we're most narrowly focused on, as I understand it, the price volatility and tax revenue. So here's the calculation that we've made so far. The total bar, which comes to about 575 million, if you can see the horizontal axis there, that represents the total surplus that we have so far this fiscal year. For July, August, September, and October of this year, total surplus comes to 575 million. That's the total bar. According to our calculations, the yellow portion is the portion that is directly attributable to the increase in gas prices. Does that make sense? It comes to about 20%. I'm going to walk you through it more in depth in a second, but the yellow portion amounts to about 20% of the total surplus, and that's how much we think is directly attributable to that price jump that we've observed this year. And this is how I get to that. The total surplus for the first 4 months, for the first third of this fiscal year, I mean, this ends on October 31st. I'm not counting so far into November, but the total surplus, 575 million. The expected taxable gas price that was used to construct our budget was about $2.25. Now, we'll say the taxable price deviates from the Henry Hub price that I mentioned before for several reasons. One of the big reasons is transportation costs. We don't, you have to make adjustments for transportation costs when you figure out the taxable price compared to the gross price. Anyway, the price that was used to make that budget forecast back a year ago or whenever was $2.25. The actual price that we see now that's relevant for the taxable calculation is $5. So we're talking about a more than doubling of the relevant price to consider the budget surplus. Anyway, price goes from 225 to 5. The budgeted natural gas severance amount at that 225 price that prevailed when the budget was made was 92 million. The actual gas severance tax revenue that we've observed for the last 4 months has been 205 million. So the surplus that's directly attributable to the increase in gas prices is 113 million, which, as I said already, amounts to about 20%. Does that make sense? That's just how you walk through that bar. Now, even though I hope that's useful to you, and I hope that's one of the questions that you wanted me to address today, as I understand it, Jeff, where'd you go? Did Jeff disappear on us? Well, that's a bummer. But anyway, as I understand it, that's what he wanted me to calculate when he asked me to come and visit today. And that's how I made the calculation. But I want to be very, shoot. Let me just skip ahead. I've kind of gone off script just a little bit, but I just want to be very clear that there are 3 other factors that we're not considering. Higher gas prices also boost corporate tax collections. Okay, so the higher gas prices have also affected the surplus through corporate tax collections, but that's a more complicated calculation. There's a lag effect there, and it's more complicated to make that calculation because what I showed before was just directly severance tax revenue collections. Anyway, bullet point 2, higher gas prices also boost personal income tax revenue through royalty income. So we've had more royalty income that's boosted PIT revenue as well. Third, the higher gas prices, or as I have it worded here, reductions in gas prices. Either way, there's going to be a correlation between gas prices and coal prices. We've certainly seen that this year. So this year, the higher gas prices have also boosted coal prices as there's some substitutability between gas and coal. So the higher coal prices also affect severance tax revenue through that secondary channel. All 3 of those things are additional ways in which these higher prices affect severance tax collections that we have not accounted for. Okay, so when I go back here, when I say the yellow portion is how much of the surplus that's attributable to gas prices, just keep in mind that's just direct severance tax revenue effects. The yellow portion would be bigger. It 100% sure is bigger if you adequately account for that corporate income tax transmission mechanism, the personal income tax transmission mechanism, and the transmission mechanism through coal prices through the severance tax. So this is an understatement of how much this price volatility has driven a surplus. Okay, but I don't want to sound lame, but those calculations that I mentioned take a little bit of time to do because they're more complicated, and just I don't know if I should act like a wimp here, but I only had 4 business days to put this together. So I'd be happy to, do I sound wimpy by saying that? I'm kind of apologizing here. I'd be happy to provide you with a more detailed memo that lays out a more accurate estimate of how much of this surplus is due to the gas price volatility, but I just need a little bit more time to account for the one transmission mechanism plus the other 3 that I've listed here. Does that make sense? Furthermore, I showed you at the beginning, we expect gas prices to fall over the course of the next year. We expect gas prices will still be very high compared to what we've seen over the last decade a year from now, but we don't expect them to be quite as high as they are right now. So if we were to take the expected price and apply it to our current surplus. Now, this is a little bit of apples and oranges here because I'm talking about the current surplus. I'm talking about what will happen to prices over the next year. If things go as expected, then the surplus will shrink by that amount. Okay, the new surplus will be more like 500 million versus 575 million if prices fall as expected. But again, that's an understatement because that's not accounting for the PIT, the CIT, and the coal prices. But that's at least a conservative estimate of what will happen to the surplus over the next year if prices fall back down as the Energy Information Administration projects they will. They may not. We don't know what's going to happen in Europe. There's been a lot of uncertainty in the world, of course, over the last year or so in our economy. But if prices fall as expected, that's what will directly happen to the surplus, not accounting for those other transmission mechanisms. And there's one more caveat to throw out. Higher gas prices also mean higher prices for consumers, for just people who are paying their gas bill for their house. This shows what's happened to the price that we pay for natural gas just in our homes when we're paying our heat bill, when we're paying for a heat bill or water heater bill or, cook stove bill. So higher gas prices take money away from consumers. So that will, to some extent, diminish spending in the economy. As people have to pay higher gas bills, they have less money to spend on other factors. That's what's happened so far to gas prices for home heating, and it will probably increase more over the next year or so, as there's a lag between those global prices and what customers actually see, because we're a regulated state. There's a lag there, so prices will get even worse. So that's another issue that needs to be considered, is reduce consumer spending because customers are paying for higher gas bills. They don't have as much money left over to spend on food, entertainment, whatever else. So that's it. That's the bottom line. Like I say, happy to make that more in-depth calculation that considers the other transmission mechanisms if you would like. That's more complicated, but it can be done to provide a more full estimate of how much of this is due to gas prices. And of course, the thing that I haven't mentioned is the 40-year high in inflation that we've been observing over the past few months. That's a big driver of the surplus as well. The fact that prices have gone up by 8% altogether, that's really affected personal income tax revenue and sales tax revenue, just because of inflation. So if we were to diagram how much of the bar is due to inflation, that would be a big chunk of the bar as well. It was pretty short and sweet. Any questions at all?
Senator Tar.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Deskins. You mentioned the difference between the Henry Hub and then in West Virginia and the transportation cost affecting the severance tax that we collect. Is there a difference in price that's paid for West Virginia gas overall versus gas that's paid for out of the Henry Hub?
There is a difference. I mean, here in the Appalachian Basin, we do see different prices compared to Henry Hub. If my energy economist were here, he could explain it to you in a good amount of detail why that difference exists between the national benchmark Henry Hub and here in the Appalachian Basin. There's a difference. I used Henry Hub because that's the standard measure nationally. And for this purpose, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference because I just showed that for illustrative purposes to show how much volatility that we've had. The overall level of prices is different, but the degree to which we've seen volatility, I think would be pretty close between Henry Hub and our prices here. But like I say, though, even our gross price here has to be adjusted to get at the taxable price because of those transportation costs that affect how we apply the tax.
So we have, I want to make sure I understand it correctly. So the West Virginia gas is bought at a lesser price than it's bought out of Henry Hub. And then we also take off transportation costs in addition to that. So there's a significant difference on what we would be collecting versus if it was coming out of Henry Hub and we get the same price for that. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And just to kick it over, if you talk to Mark Mukow, for example, from the Revenue Department, he can give you a very precise explanation of how we get from the gross price to the taxable price. There's some technicalities in that mix there that I don't fully understand, but he can give you a really precise description of how we get from the starting price to the taxable price. But the bottom line is the taxable price has more than doubled now compared to when the forecast was made back when.
Any other questions? Dr. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. Let me know if you need any more detail. I'll be happy to provide it.
Right. The clerk has notified me that we do have a quorum. So at this point in time, I would recognize my co-chair, Senator Weld, for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the minutes from the previous meeting be approved.
Senator Weld has moved that the minutes of our previous meeting be moved. Is there discussion on those minutes? If no discussion, all those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it and the motion carries. Our next presenter is giving us a presentation on a spray-on treatment for remediation of oil and produced water spills at a reduced cost. Our presenter is Angela Bandy. She is a Bachelor of Science professional engineer from Vandy Consulting.
Hi, guys. I'm Angela. I grew up in Wood County. I went to Marietta College, and I have been lucky enough to work all over the world. I'm going to talk to you today about an environmental solution. And the reason it affects you is because it allows business in oil and gas to operate easier because we can clean up our spills. We can also clean up existing contamination much cheaper and much faster with efficiencies than what we've done before. So I'm actually a fracker, a completion engineer by experience. I've been in oil and gas almost 30 years now. And my goal is to preserve the environment and do these operations. So the reason that's significant, sometimes they go head to head. Frackers, oil and gas production, multi-stage says it's dirty. There's a lot of things that are said and I won't reinforce those, but we have a way of cleaning them up. So I think I merge business with environmental in a way that's cost effective that hasn't been regularly adopted. I'm going to talk to you today about that. It is a solution. It's not pending. It's actually commercial. We've been doing it for about 10 years. It's proven. We have lab results and you're going to get to see all of that. So what we're going to do is clean up oil spills. And I put this slide on here because the conventional way to treat contamination, whether it's 60 years old or 6 hours old, is to typically dig it up and take it to a landfill. Those landfills, the EPA monitors those landfills. They actually have a liner and that liner can leak. It's allowed about 2 holes per acre plus or minus. So to find a solution is what I'm going to show you. It's not a Band-Aid like what we currently do. I'm approved with the DEP. We've done some soil sampling with them. We've proven some of these results. We are a West Virginia company and we do also operate internationally. So there's a lot of credibility behind this. I'm going to show you a lot of pictures today and just walk through. I've simplified this because it is very simple. What we do is take an oil spill, a produced water spill, an oil facility site that has contamination, and sometimes that contamination has already seeped into the groundwater. So it's not a good circumstance. And we can treat it in place. So the reason that's significant is treating it in place means we aren't digging that soil and putting it somewhere else to a landfill. We're actually cleaning it up. And because we aren't moving the soil, we reduce emissions by about 90%. We have about 90% less trucks by doing a spray-on treatment. So you're keeping the air clean and you're cleaning the soil. So it's a double benefit. You're doing this for about 10 times less cost than any other method. Checks every box. So we have a couple of hub depots. I'm out of Parkersburg, so there's one in Lubeck. We treat the whole state of West Virginia. We have a number of different trucks, and I'm putting a truck on here. This is actually from one of our Canada depots. I like this truck because the name of the company is Holland Acid, and I see humor in that. What we've done is we've partnered with trucking companies to keep our costs low to pass on to you, so we don't have heavy equipment. We partner with the heavy equipment guys to deploy the chemicals. If you want to use a rule of thumb about how this treats, you fill up a truck with treatment chemical and you spray it on. About a barrel of treatment treats about 400 square feet. So that's a barrel, like a rain barrel, treating your living room. Plus or minus, that's a rule of thumb. So one barrel treats about 400 square feet. And this is one of the sites. Again, this was a heavily contaminated site. The contamination went down about 10 feet. It had seeped over about 4 decades. So what they did is the topsoil had been taken off over the last, say, 20 years and repopulated with a new topsoil, so it wasn't killing wildlife. They had to treat down to 10 feet, and this is actually our guys doing the treatment. So we scraped off the topsoil that had already been replaced, piled it to the side, and then sprayed on our treatment. So this did a couple of things that I want to point out. It allowed the treatment, the liquid treatment, to seep into raw soil. It didn't get caught in the vegetation at surface. And it also, the money they'd spent on fresh soil was preserved, and then we just rake that back on top. So whatever situation they have with old or new contamination, whatever kind of site, we work with all of them. What you're seeing here is a little bit more of the trucks and the totes. When we remediate an oil spill, a lot of times the techniques and the technology are to remove the soil or to add a biological source, because a biological source would eat the carbon. That is actually not the greatest idea, because when you're adding a biological source, it disrupts the natural balance of the soil. So you're actually creating a problem down the road because you've increased some different bacteria and biological sources. So ours is not a biological source. It takes your natural bacteria and makes them really hungry. So they start going after the oil and they eat. So if your spill is not uniform, and none of them are, they spill and then they seep and they migrate. The viscosity of this treatment migrates with the oil spill, and the bugs also like the taste of oil, and they are naturally activated by our treatment to become very hungry and eat, and they will eat until all of the contamination is gone. The viscosity follows the treatment, the bugs follow the food source. So it's not harmful to normal processes. And what's left behind is no noticeable residue. It's actually a metabolite, something that's good for the soil. We also treat salt water. So as you know, when you produce oil, there's salt water in there, and the salt water comes from either produced water, dissolving parts of the rock, a number of different things, but it's usually chloride based. So it's a whole different contamination, but we treat it the same way. The cocktail is different, but for what people see on surface, it's the same. It's a spray on treatment. It takes a little bit longer. So because salt water is actually, I'll show you a few pictures here, it actually burns the soil, it burns it, scars it. The treatment takes a little bit longer, so we spray it on and it remediates over a number of weeks to months. We've been implementing these treatments for a long time. This is proven, this is predictable. Chemistry is awesome, because if you do the same thing, it's one of the few systems in the universe. You do the same thing, you can repeat it and get the same results. That's what we do. We sell this on a few different ways. Some clients have small spills, some have big spills, some have old spills, some have new spills. Whatever you have, you can see if you have a small spill, you'd use a small drum. If you have a bigger spill, totes and tank trucks, whatever you need. And again, the rule of thumb is 1 drum per living room size, 400 square feet. So what I'm going to show you next is a few pictures, and we've had great success with this, but with great success, clients don't want a lot of their information released. So I've duplicated some of the results, and the pictures that I do show you have been released, and we do have permission. So I'm duplicating results. This is actually on a client site. We are not able to release their data, but you're going to see a few pictures. What we're doing is a small scale demonstration. So we are actually taking a simulation of the environment. So we're taking some grass seeds, planting them, making them healthy, and we're going to kill them with an oil spill. This is actual oil from one of our clients. It's crude oil. It's relatively heavy oil, very normal. And we spill it onto our fresh grass seeds. So if you have a spill like this, you can see it's pooling at surface, and it actually has sunk in. There's so much oil. It's migrated to the bottom of the demonstration, the flower pot, and pooled at surface. So it's highly saturated. And within a couple of days, the oil smell is strong, the grass is dead. You can actually see an oily look to the surface of the soil. It's a bad spill. We treat it. So in this demonstration, you can see I'm treating it, and this is about the volume that you'd use for about that kind of soil. And you just spray on, a simple spray on treatment right in place, no fuss, no trucking. And within about a week, the smell has disappeared. And the reason that I point this out is because I've done a lot of these lab tests for clients. So even the DEP gave us a contaminated soil sample, and it was smelly at the time. And if you spill where there's residents, and we do see a lot of spills where there's residents, the first thing they complain about is the smell. This takes care of the smell rapidly. And then we start to see the soil remediate. And you can see visually, I'll show you a lab test too, but I'm going to show you the visual. So in about a week and a half, the soil is less oily. These natural bacteria that was in the soil are activated by our treatment and are eating that carbon base. You can see sprouts and we seed the soil. So to have regrowth, if the grass is all dead, we plant seeds, and then you want to see a visual, a regrowth. That's really good for people that are watching. Hey, we want to have that visual for them. You can see the grass growing. You can see the number of days. We're at about 2.5 weeks, about 3 weeks. You can see the grass growing out of the pot. So in less than a month, this is a side view. We've remediated the soil and have grass growing out the side. So in an oil spill, you can remediate for about $1,000 a well burp, and you can do it on site, and you can do it even if the well burped yesterday or if it burped 50 years ago. This all works. I'm going to show you the simulated saltwater spill. This one is slightly different. Your produced water in a well is going to be 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 parts per million of chlorides of salt. I'm doing 100,000, so I'm doing way more. And the reason I'm doing this is to demonstrate how the soil looks when you get a burn, a saltwater spill. So you can see how heavily saturated that produced water is. You can see that the salt isn't even dissolving, it's saturated. It kills the grass, and I want to point out that the grass is killed and it's white. It's actually singed, it's burned. So when you have in real life a saltwater spill, it burns your grass, it burns your ground, it burns the soil, and it prevents all life. So all of your natural bacteria is gone. If you have, I'll show you one thing that happened as a surprise in one of these tests. You have natural wildlife, and in this case, it's like gnats. They're all dead, they're burned. I'm doing a treatment, so you can see it's a cap full of treatment for that. So again, there's your volume, there's your ratio of treatment, relatively small and manageable. You can see within about a week, the seeds that were in there are starting to grow. So the soil is very slowly remediating, much slower than an oil spill. We seed it again, and it grows much slower. So the reason it grows much slower is because the spill was very high concentration, but you can see the soil is remediating slowly. Here's the picture. So what you're seeing there, the little black dots are all bug bodies. And the bug bodies are significant because the soil was in a closed environment. Nothing was coming in or out. And as it started to remediate, even though these insects that were native in the soil died, the eggs that they laid were able to hatch during the remediation, and the bugs were coming out. So you can see there's quite a few of them, and it just goes to prove a visual remediation for something that is a technique. It's just a way of proving this. A second treatment was required. So if you have a very big spill, a very deep spill, or a high concentrated spill, you might need more than one treatment. This needed more than one treatment. It also, when you have a saltwater spill, we actually recommend, in one of the photos I showed you how we scrape the topsoil off. Sometimes you need to till the topsoil. We call it scratching. It can be done with farming equipment. It can be done with construction equipment, and you just scratch the surface, because if it's hard and crusty, you want your treatment to sink in. You don't want it to run off. So here's a summary of this. What you're seeing is, first slide is the heavy oil spill. It's pooling its surface. It's absolutely saturated. It can't sink in anymore. Then you see the dead grass, dead soil, greasiness, and then you see it after treatment. So about a month to remediate something in place at 1/10 the cost of any other recommendation. And here's the produced water. So we ask for up to 6 months to do your lab test when you treat a produced water spill, because it actually does burn the soil, and the chemistry involved is a chemistry. It's not actually using the natural bacteria. It's a chemical reaction. It's an ion exchange, and it works over and over again. Here's the summary. Basically a quick remediation by a spray on. And here's what I wanted to show you. This is a third-party lab, and we did get approval to release this. The reason this is important, and I showed you the visual in the demonstration, the reason this is important is it shows you the mathematical by somebody taking a spill. And in this spill, this was one of our clients in Alberta. They had a spill and they had a site. So how they got this site, it wasn't their contamination. They did not want to remediate. They bought a gas plant, and with that gas plant came these sites. They call it orphan sites there. So they didn't want to have to clean them up, but the government forced them to. They got an environmental company, sampled, said, this is how contaminated it is. Oh no. We treated it. And then about 2.5 months after, every single parameter they measured increased, improved by at least 80%. You can see that down at the bottom. So that is salt, that is oil, that is everything. So it's not their site to clean up. They were forced to, they didn't want to spend the money. They were very reluctant, and they still got good results by our treatment. They were happy to save the money and still get approval from the government. So it's friendly, environmentally friendly, works fast, cost effective, less emissions. And I have a handful of slides here that I find impressive, and I hope that you will too. I think there's only 4 or 5 of them. So these are before and after. I put this one on here because this gas plant had contamination down about 12 feet. It was old. It had been sitting. It had had brush grow up. It was actually inaccessible. We had to build a road to get to it. So they did a flower pot test. They asked me to do a flower pot test. They had 3 different areas of contamination: a diesel pit, well, effluent, produced water, and remediated it. And we actually did lab tests on this, and I can't release the data, but in less than a month, we were seeing grass grow. We did the lab test to show that the growing grass proved the soil was remediated, and they did a full site remediation. They had budgeted about 1.7 million for this. We did it for $100,000. The president called me and thanked me for, first, a job well done, and second, saving them so much money. They are going to be doing every single spill that they have in this property they acquired with this, based on the success of the first job. So they had 1.7 million budgeted. We did it for about 100,000. Everybody's happy. This is an unconventional one, and I put this in here because it's kind of cool. So maybe you know, maybe you don't. I did not know that the transformer boxes that are in our front yards and by our playgrounds that give us the power that we want, the electricity that we want, burp oil. That's why they're inside a box, also to protect us from the electric jolt. But they're inside of a box and they burp oil. This is in a guy's front yard. There's many of these. And the utility company contracted us to come up with a way to treat inside the boxes so that they aren't harming people's dogs that eat the grass, that don't even know that the grass is growing in oil contaminated soil. And we treated it. When we opened the box, you could smell the oil. We treated it. We found a way to do that. Just pour it down. We do have their electricians on site to make sure that nobody is electrocuted with this in situ treatment. Came back, took another soil sample. Everything had remediated more than 90% in this case in about a month and a half. And here's another. This is atypical. So I'm just showing you kind of some of the things that most normal stuff that you saw in the beginning of the presentation. These are abnormal. This one was from a construction site, and they are building houses on this site. It's a new community. And in this new community, they're sampling soil and they found out it was contaminated. So they're starting construction of houses. They give me the soil sample. You can see it's dirty. It was the smelliest sample that I had, and it had a lot of chemical contamination because it had an odor. I treated it, and in 24 hours, you can see the visual difference. So this is unusual, first, because a 24-hour remediation is really fast, but it was so contaminated, the dramatic improvement between hugely contaminated and cleaning up is visual in this. So I thought I'd include that. This is, I think, the next to the last slide. This is one of the client sites, and what you're looking at here is where they said, put your money where your mouth is. So what we did is they compared the digging and the trucking cost and efficiency. So moving it to a landfill, the common practice. They added in a different area a biological source. And in this pit that's roped off, it's actually lined for us because the contamination is all inside that liner. They treated with our treatment. So they compared conventional, biological, and this remediation. We came in cheaper than everything else, more efficient than everything else, less emissions than everything else, and they were very pleased. So I'd like to say the name of this company because it's quite a flagship remediation, but it is a company, a very well-known company traded on the stock exchange, and they operate in 2 countries. So that's the end, but I have one bonus slide. So what you just saw was a proven commercial process, proven, repeatable, predictable, approved by the government. What you're looking at here is in its pilot stages. This is also remediation. This is a different treatment, but it's along the same lines because we want to give oil and gas and coal companies the right to do their business, the right to produce, because that creates jobs and prosperity for our state. But we also want it to be environmental. What you're looking at here are coal tailings. The coal tailings are something that gives our coal a bad name. So it's the residual crap that comes when we make coal. And we want coal, we want power, we want everything that comes with it. And if we can do it and preserve the environment, which we can, then we're winning. So what you're looking at first in the bucket is coal tailings. They sat for years and they don't separate naturally, they stink. Within a few minutes, so about 10 minutes, we added it's a two-step treatment for this, and it's a different chemical. It's patent pending at the time, so it's not commercial yet, but you can see how it separates. The reason that this is important for West Virginia is West Virginia has rare earth elements in the coal. We're one of the only places that has rare earth elements. And as Mongolia is producing their rare earth elements and charging us a whole bunch of money, we actually have a resource. And the reason we can't use it with conventional coal production is we burn the coal. So the rare earth elements are burned, they're vitrified. When you have the coal tailings, the rare earth elements are sustainable and they are not burned. So when we separate this out, it gives us those rare earth elements as a cash flow stream so we can remediate the coal tailings and we can get the rare earth elements, which is beautiful for our state. And that's separate procedure. So that's your bonus slide. Okay, that's all. You guys have any questions?
Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Vandy?
Yes, sir.
Senator Nelson?
To what extent have you done anything here in West Virginia versus other states?
Yes, so it has extensive use in some other states. And again, I'm not supposed to mention the states because it's under a different name than this. So this has been name guarded. In West Virginia, we have done soil samples and the flower pot test that you saw the pictures of. We've done that for the DEP to demonstrate first their contamination and then their remediation. So we've only done flower pot test pilot projects in West Virginia. But that's, in my opinion, that's how you prove if you have a site that's contaminated, you say, well, this is too good to be true. You give me the soil, I do the testing, I give you the results, and then you can spend the money on the full site.
Is your process patented?
This process is not patented. The coal process is patent pending. This process is not patented for the specific reason that the blend, no one else has the blend, and our chemist is about 76 years old now and he's crackerjack. He does not want to patent this because he does not want to release the proprietary cocktail. So it is not patented. It's held underneath our umbrella. It's incorporated and it's protected through the incorporation and through trade secrets.
So I probably know the answer. This next question is the cost.
So the cost, if you want to do your one barrel on your 400 square feet, your living room, it's about $1,000. Very affordable. If you want to do, like, a lot of times they get a truckload. So you want to do 10 sites at once, we'll get a truckload. The truckload is about $80,000 and it treats a quarter of an acre. So that treats between 10 and 25 sites, depending on where you are, for about $80,000. And they're just rules of thumb. It depends on the concentration, but I like to know the numbers too. I want to know a ballpark. So one truckload, 1/4 acre, 80 grand. Evan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Does it work in the winter time?
Great question. You're an environmentalist, I can tell. It does work in the wintertime. It slows down. So in the wintertime, when things freeze up, we want to have our liquid in the ground, percolated through and already acting by the time freeze up happens. So freeze up happens in different states and different countries at different times. We don't like to pump it when it's frozen because it's not going to penetrate. So you need contact and you need it to sink in. So when it's frozen, we actually discourage clients, and some have done it when it's frozen. We prefer to get it in. Of course, everybody has common sense. Of course, you put it in the ground when it's not frozen. When it freezes over, your top layer freezes, everything's in place, it reacts. So no, don't encourage frozen. Does it work? Yes, it does. It's better when it's thawed or before freeze up.
Okay, another question. You mentioned that the ingredients are proprietary. But are there any ingredients where there would be any concern about leaching into groundwater or surface water, violating standards?
Excellent question. And everything is environmentally friendly. So we do have safety data sheets, MSDS, that show everything that you need to know that's hazardous. And this is not meant to treat groundwater, but as it goes in, we've treated a site where there was a river flowing nearby and it was a flowing river. So we wanted to stop this before it got to the river. It was an operator site. They didn't stop it before it got to the river. It contaminated the river. We pumped this and treated, and we calculated enough volume so it would treat the soil, treat the ground. And as it went towards the river, it would remediate everything it touched, because as the river moves, it dilutes it. So you can't treat moving water. There's no issue with it going into the groundwater, even though it's not meant to treat groundwater. It will not contaminate groundwater. So yes, it doesn't leach, it doesn't leave byproducts. There is nothing that's unenvironmental in it. Everything is meant to heal, to clean, to remediate.
My last question is about the DEP here in West Virginia. Which office at the DEP have you been communicating with?
Charleston office,
Okay.
Charleston and Parkersburg. So we worked with Alan Flowers. And what do they call him? James, and they have a nickname for him and it's escaping me at the moment. And he's the director. We've also worked with government agencies in other parts of the world, in Colombia, and then obviously in Canada. In Canada, the government agencies cannot give approval. Canada is one of the most, maybe you know, but I've seen it firsthand. They're one of the most environmental conscious places in the whole world, and their regulations are freaking strict. So working with them to do this, we actually gave them notification and they liked it. They cannot endorse a product because of competitive interest and conflict of interest, but they let us pump it. They see the results and we got one of these. So that's good news. The DEP, James Martin. So yeah, so Marty is the one that was aware of this. Alan Flowers, Scott Rodenheaver. So those are the people in the DEP, and we've been working with them for quite a while. They're familiar with the technology. They're the one that gave us the contaminated soil sample to treat and demonstrate that on a small scale it works. And now we have approval with them and we're registered with them as a service company, as a client.
And is the 90% reduction that your data shows, is that sufficient to meet some type of regulatory standard?
Great question. So when I say it's remediated 90% or 80% in 2.5 months, it continues to remediate until it's all gone. So, and clients, typically governments that I've worked with, want to see that improvement. They want to see the step improvement in 2.5 months. But each time you take a soil sample, a lot of times these are deep and they have to drill boreholes, then take it to a third-party lab, then do an analysis. So typically the government is looking for remediation and signs that remediation continues. And very seldom do we ever have to go all the way to the end. We have to show the intent, show that it's cleaning up, get rid of the smell, get rid of the contamination. And a lot of times, even though this is going after oil and produced water, it also remediates some of the carcinogens like benzene, toluene, the cyclical hydrocarbons. It actually remediates them too. So it's taking down your contamination on many levels. But we don't put that out there because I don't want to oversell that. But as you know the chemistry, you can see how cyclical hydrocarbons get into the soil as contamination from oil production. You can see how it remediates too, because these would chomp on those bonds and break them as well.
Further questions? Senator Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Angela, for being here today. I had stepped out a couple of minutes, so I hope this question, or you didn't answer this question. In my district, and I'm sure in everybody's district, there's a lot of old gas stations, property where their gas tanks are buried, and it costs so much to reclaim this that people will not buy the property. Is this a process that could be used without having to dig up all the soil, hauled into a toxic waste site? Could be used?
Yes, it's perfect for that. So we actually had an application similar to that where there was an old gas station, the tank had leaked, and it was left standing. It had actually leaked under the road and into a baseball diamond, according to an environmental company, a third-party environmental company it was sampling. So all we did was treat the site, and we did treat where the contamination had migrated to. So you can treat like that. You can treat a second site that we did that's pertinent to this, but not quite exact. They had pilings in the ground, so footers, very deep, and everything had contaminated down and around the pilings. They did not want to dig up the pilings because they'd been abandoned. So they had cut off the pilings, say 3 feet from surface, but around the pilings, there was contamination pooling. So all you have to do is pump this treatment and it goes and it can remediate the contamination around a tank and around a piling. So even if you don't want to dig up the tank, or if you have dug the tank and the contamination has migrated, this will chase it. It will continue to remediate. So it's pumped. Part of the secret of doing that is making the viscosity of this fluid similar to the viscosity of the contamination fluid. So they follow similar paths. The second thing is making it so I actually calculate the volume. I do a lot of the designs of this. And if the contamination is deep, I'll put a lot of this treatment on with extra fluid to help push it deeper. So the hydrostatic pressure of the water is pushing it down through the soil, and that's how I get it deeper. And we've also drilled, if there's a tank, usually those aren't too deep. Those aren't usually 50 feet deep, they're 10 feet. But if you have contamination 20, 30, 40 feet, the environmental companies drill boreholes to test the soil. We can actually put a treatment down those same boreholes and push it out that way. So that's how we get it deeper. If it's more than 10 feet, it's kind of my cutoff to treat from surface. But 10 feet is this height here, roughly. So we can treat from surface this height. And with West Virginia soil, there's a lot of clay. The clay, it kind of almost acts as a buffer, a prevention for some of that contamination to go deeper. So sometimes the clay works in our favor to keep the contamination higher. And the clay layers typically are not continuous. They're more heterogeneous. So if we have to pump below a clay layer, we can either use the environmental company's boreholes, or we can do a treatment such that we avoid the clay layers. And we know them because the environmental company tells us they've already got their baseline, and they tell us a little bit of insight on what we're treating. So for the most part, the hard work is done by the environmental companies. The oil companies know they have contamination because somebody has measured it, and we just walk in and treat it. We've made it that simple. We try and package it up simple. We try and package it cheap. We try and have all the approvals. So you pick up the phone and say, I have this, and we say, got it. We'll bring a truck out and you say, these are the sites.
So this would be feasible for someone that bought a piece of property that had a couple gas tanks on it, you know, from years ago, because all these small towns used to have 5 or 6 gas stations. It'd be feasible, and they could dig up the tanks, get rid of them, and treat the soil without removing the soil, correct?
Yes, thank you. And that's one of the things that I'm proud of personally, is because of the cost of this, if you do have 5 or 6 gas stations, you can remediate that for a fraction of the price. So if you budgeted to do 1, this allows you to do usually 10 because of the cost difference, and sometimes even 15 depending. So if you budget money to clean up 1 with conventional processes, but use this instead, you can typically do a majority of the things on your list. And our clients like that.
And what kind of process going forward would we have, would the DEP, you know, play in this? I mean, I'm assuming as long as the soil test good, then you're good to go, correct? After the
Yes.
treatment?
Yeah, so to start off, you can send me directly. My email is on a lot of these different slides, but send me an analysis of what your contamination is. The environmental companies know, anybody that removed a tank knows, everybody has sampled soil in so many places. And that's why soil contamination is a hot button, because we do know that there's so much of it. But the fact that we know means that we have an analysis. I look at the analysis, design a treatment. They're not that hard to design. Make sure that it does a treatment. We do call the government agencies out of courtesy. They cannot give us approval typically, but they can, out of courtesy, know what we're doing. They can't endorse it because of conflict of interest, but they love hearing about it. And in fact, we've done Zoom presentations for government agencies in multiple locations because they want their field office as well as their engineering office to know what we're going to do. and then see the results. So we do involve the government. We're very open with this. We involve anybody that owns the site, anybody that's curious, and we'll share this with them. We'll even do the sampling. I call it a flower pot test, but it's a pilot test. So you'll give me really a shovel full of soil. I'll put it in a pot. We'll have the baseline measurement because you know it's contaminated. I'll treat it. And then we'll have a third-party lab do another analysis. And you can see on a small scale how much remediation happens in 2 months. And then we can monitor it again in 6 months and you can see how it continues to remediate.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman.
I can just ask, Lou.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question for the deeper contamination where it's almost in situ and you have to deal with it deeper. Do you have to add things like oxygenation to your product or is it not necessary?
Great question. I can tell you have experience. All of you guys have good experience. No, we don't need to add oxygenation.
Interesting.
It works on kind of a facultative. So a facultative reaction can happen with air or without air, aerobic or anaerobic. And because we are using the native bacteria in the soil, we are not adding anything foreign that way. It works natively just as its normal practices do. So we don't add any trauma to any of the ground when we do this. So yeah, it doesn't need oxygen. It doesn't need, the worst thing that it might need is 2 treatments if it's heavily contaminated, but I have yet to see a site that has needed 2 treatments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? None so.
Thanks.
Ms. Vandy, thank you for your presentation. Is there any other business to come before this committee? And so I recommend my vice chair for a motion. Motion's been made that we adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. This meeting's adjourned. Thank you.